Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. Very happy for you to join us. I'm Bob Weathers, and I'm here with my friend
Odie Martinez.
Hi, Odie. It's good to be with Odie. Good to be with you all. Austin Armstrong is handling all of the technical aspects today in the studio. I want to thank you, Austin, for your good work. Also, I want to extend appreciation to Beginnings Treatment Centers and Therapy Cable that are our sponsors for each week's podcasts. And while I'm on that topic, if you have interest, if you like today's presentation, I recommend that you go to our Facebook group and check out previous presentations. We've been doing this weekly for over a year now. You can also find them on the Beginnings Treatment Center homepage under podcasts, under media archives, I think. And so look up podcast there and you'll see us there. And then finally, you can also go to YouTube and find our podcast. So there's lots of ways to check out what is developed into quite a fund of information. Also, I want to recommend and invite you to reach out today during real time, as Odie and I are hosting this material today. Austin will be the moderator, and you can write him at Ask an Addiction Specialist. Just send a note to him, and he'll pass it on to Odie and me, and we'll be happy to respond. So anyway, really invite you to submit questions, comments as they come up for you. So let's dive in. Last week we talked about giving thanks as a way to reduce stress. I highly commend you to that podcast if you weren't here to see us. Is also related to Thanksgiving, but it's related specifically to the topic of grace. Our title for today is Cheap versus Costly Grace. And we intend to unpack that as we go forward today. In order to kind of create the foundation for talking about grace, and we'll talk more about that in a few moments, we need to review something that we've talked a lot about over the last year, and that is shame. Shame ends up being a central topic in the work that I do in addiction recovery work. That is my background. I come into recovery coaching with a background in psychology, and some things I learned early on in psychology before I learned them firsthand. Learned it first in a textbook and decided that wasn't enough. Had to learn it firsthand. One of the things I learned early on is that that shame is the most stressful negative human emotion. More stressful than anger, even though anger is stressful, more stressful than fear, and that's obviously also stressful, is shame. And so let's define shame as we've talked about it over the last year or so, and then move into talking about its antidote, which is grace. We talk about shame sometimes in terms of two sides of a coin. The way that psychology describes shame is that it represents the response to two threats. The first threat is a threat to social acceptance, a threat to connection. And so anytime that I am facing the possibility of being kicked out of a relationship or a group that matters to me, up kicks my stress response. You can actually measure it in terms of elevated cortisol, which is the brain's stress hormone. So that's stressful. We're wired to be connected, and any threat to that is a threat to survival. So that's one side of the coin of shame. If you flip that around, the other side of the coin, which is related, is another threat, and that's a threat to self-esteem. Psychology talks about self-esteem being based upon competence, or more technically, self-efficacy. Anything that's a threat to my perception of competence, where I feel incompetent, is also a threat to my survival, and that's going to kick up cortisol. It's going to kick up a stress response. And the term that we use, the lay term that we use for both of those, is shame. And we feel ashamed. And shame is a freeze response. We had a guest on a few weeks ago, in fact twice now, Angela McLeod, who talked into the neuroscience of shame in terms of the vagal nerves and so on. I recommend you to those presentations. But as Angela expounded on this, if you think of a fight or flight reaction in the emotional center of the brain, where if there's a threat, we fight against it or we flee, there's actually a third response, and this is the subject of her presentations. There's a freeze response, and in the realm of emotion, shame is a deer in the headlights. Yeah. When I'm ashamed, there's a deer in the headlights kind of response, and we'll see how that plays out here in just a few moments. Question, how does shame relate to addiction? Well, as I ask my clients, in fact, a group from Beginnings right now, in fact, some of the group from Beginnings are watching right now, and so I want to give a shout out to all of you who are just in the group where we discussed this. What is the number one trigger for relapse? From a psychological perspective, the number one trigger for relapse to addiction is stress. And now we just established that the most stressful human emotion is shame. That's the connection to addiction. There's a sad irony built into this, is that as I understand active addiction from the inside as well as clinically and theoretically and research-wise, is that, as I say it, the poor get poorer. And what I mean by that, oftentimes what will happen if I'm experiencing low self-esteem or experiencing being marginalized, it makes me vulnerable to addiction. And the biology of that would be that in the presence of stress, which being shamed, being separated from others, being separated from a sense of feeling competent, that kicks up my stress. Well, addictive behaviors, whether it's substance or other behaviors, will reduce my stress levels. The biology of that is that there's kind of a teeter-totter there, is that when cortisol, the stress hormones, are high, the body and the brain want to regulate that, and they can balance that out with another chemical, and it starts with the D. Any guess what that is, Klaus?
Dopamine.
Very good. We're so subtle around here. No, I think most of the clients in my groups know this at this point. And it's helpful as shorthand to understand. I think it's very helpful to look at our addictions, to look at them at arm's length and look at them objectively. I don't see this as making an excuse for any of our addictions, but it's to understand that. In fact, if I don't understand my addiction, I am especially vulnerable to shame. Because the sense is, if I'm addicted, there must be something broken about me. And that's one way to understand it. But there's problems, because if shame is a freeze response, shame will freeze my forward movement. And so if we go back and looking at the what I think of as a vicious cycle with addiction, I start off being ashamed. I engage in whatever my addictive behavior is. And how does that leave me feeling, Odie?
More shame.
More shame, Odie. That's right. Exactly. So you see the cycle.
Yes.
Shame breeds addiction. The addictive behavior evokes the consequence, the emotional consequence, more often than not. I rarely sit in the presence of young men and women in recovery from addiction who would be ignorant of what we're talking about, is that they all know. In fact, I'll ask, how many of you have yourselves used when you know that it was to self-medicate? And virtually everybody will raise their hand.
Right.
And there's different things that we want to self-medicate against. For example, trauma is not an unusual response to one to medicate against that because of the stress related to trauma. Shame, because it's such a killing feeling, wants to be put away. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to go above it by getting high.
Yeah.
The problem with that is a temporary fix. The shame remains. In fact, it actually exacerbates or makes worse the shame, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How are we doing so far?
Pretty good. I was going to ask, how difficult do you think it is for some people to name that?
Oh, I think it's really difficult for most people. Thank you
Yeah.
for asking that.
Welcome.
The tricky thing about it is, and I feel strongly about this, I have to tell you, I've talked with a few friends about this. I began writing a book. I'm
That's
laughing.
not good.
No, because I've written 3 versions of the same book. I've now
okay.
written 3 books on shame.
I thought you were going to say, I started writing a book, but I haven't finished it yet.
Well, I've actually completed 3 different books. The problem that I've come to, and this is the latest iteration, I started about 4 years ago writing a book on shame. The first book was too technical. I'm used to writing technical articles in psychology. And the only people that were going to read that were psychologists.
Right.
And I was wanting to reach out to a broader population than just psychologists who specialize in shame. So the next book was a bit better, but the third version I felt the best about it, and it was more personal. I moved from being very impersonal and research-based to closer and closer to home, the way that you and I talk.
Yeah. Okay.
And the limitation of this latest iteration, I'm calling each one of these a version of a book, and at some point, 1, 2, or maybe all 3 of them will come out. But the problem I have, and I've been stewing on this now for a few months, is that I talk about shame and I provide exercises to address shame, but I'm concerned about making it sound like shame is something that we all are familiar with consciously.
Yeah.
And I think your question underlies some of my own reservations with a book on shame, another book on shame, because honestly, most of my work is with men. I think 90% of my clients in the groups I lead and the individuals that I see, both in my offices and online, are men. And if I ask the men I work with or broach this topic of shame, they'll look at me and go, I'm not ashamed, Bob. In fact, I have to be honest, is that when I studied shame all those years ago in graduate school, I started graduate school 40 years ago this fall. And so I started studying shame right out of the starting blocks. And I wrote papers on shame. I had no flipping clue what I was writing about, because I think part of it is because I'm a guy. And I don't want to say that women don't experience this, but I wasn't raised as a female, I was raised as a male, is that I know one thing for sure, that we guys get basically two emotions. It's a great menu. How are you, Bob? I'm cool. That counts as an emotion. Or I'm pissed. I'm good or I'm mad.
That's
you get what I'm saying?
accurate.
That's the smorgasbord. Okay. Now, what's missing in that? Well, what's missing in that is anything that would be vulnerable. And so I can't tell you is not a good thing. I can't tell you if I'm sad. That's pathetic. I mean, we go down the list of every vulnerable emotion. And at the very bottom of the list would be, I just want to tell you, I'm dealing with shame, man. There's no way that we talk about being ashamed. So what guy do you go up to, including me, starting graduate school 40 years ago? I'm writing papers on shame and think that's an interesting concept. And I learned some of the stuff we just shared earlier about shame. The problem is that it's hard to identify it inside. In fact, years ago, I was in a supervision group where we studied shame at length for a good year or two, read articles, read books, and so on like that. And one of the articles, I was really struck by this, was looking at shame as a defense against shame, which is going to sound really odd. I have to go back a few years to remember how the conversation went. The bottom line is that I can actually do kind of a facsimile of shame with you.
Okay.
Dude, I'm sorry.
All right.
And it's actually a defense against the shame inside of that, which would be, I feel awful about who I am. I can't possibly let you know that. So there's kind of like, I think it was like drive-by shame. I'm ashamed. But there's no no depth to it. And so ironically, we're studying about shame, and we began to look at all the ways that we defend against shame, including saying, I'm ashamed, and no, don't mean it.
Yeah, that reminds me of being back in high school, and I'll use basketball as an illustration because that's really the best I have right now. But like, if I'd be playing like a pickup game with somebody, and maybe somebody else makes a move that makes me look silly, pretty much, then my reaction or my answer to that, because everybody around me saying, oh, you just got tricked by that guy, my reaction would be something like, well, he's not that good of a basketball player. I slipped right here. My shoes, I got the wrong shoes on. You start. But I think more specifically, taking that and bringing it back on him is like, he's not that good. He's not that good. He got
some way to divert it. Yeah. Psychology calls that displacement, where I displace some feeling, in this case shame, that's directed towards me. I can't deal with this, and so I'll project it out onto that other basketball player, and he's cheating. He tripped me. Foul. I mean, whatever like that. And so there's all kinds of ways that we can divert it. There's a comment or question that came in. Let's see what it says. Hi, Angela. It's from you. Hi there. Thank you for joining us, Angela. Angela is our third member of this group, actually the fourth member in the room here. It's nice to have you with us. She says, if shame is hard to identify, but it is so pervasive, what do you think most of us are experiencing, or what are we calling it? That's a great question. I'm going to respond instantly to you. And with more thought, it would probably ramify more richly. I'm going to stick with the example I was just using, Angela, and you're welcome to share an example that comes from your experience. But Odie and I are talking about instances where we might be ashamed on a basketball court. I wouldn't even say that. I used to just be that way.
Yeah.
I'd be irritable, and so there'd be an edge. And what's underneath that is the vulnerability. Psychology talks about anger or irritability as a secondary emotion. And what does that mean? It just means there's a primary emotion underneath that. And in this case, it might well be shame, like what you're doing with the basketball example. And who of us hasn't experienced some version of, and what does that mean? It just means it's a primary emotion in public. It feels horrible. And in this case, it would be a typical move, like what you're saying, Odie, to find some way to displace that onto somebody else. So it could be blaming. I think it can be, you can look at how it is that we take shame and outwardly project it and blame somebody else, or just generally walk around with a chip on our shoulder, the irritability and so on. I think there's other ways that can go. I think it also manifests as depression. If you think about shame as being a manifestation of the freeze response, the extreme of that could be self-doubt that as it kind of gets more and more kind of entrenched, manifests as kind of a general passivity or depression. And the way I think of depression is that, people will say, like, how are you doing, Bob? And I'll say, Odie, I'm a little bit depressed today. Really, it'd be more accurate to say I'm sad today. I'm sad today. Yeah. My work clinically with depression is it's not to say that depression doesn't manifest sometimes as sadness, but honestly, in my experience, more often depression manifests as flatness. It would almost be an improvement to be able to feel sadness. Sadness and grief is a natural response to that. But if I move into a place of stuckness where I can only go so far, and as a guy, I'm vulnerable to doing that. I clip off the sorrow or the sadness. It can manifest then as a kind of pervasive dullness or flatness where I kind of have dead eyes or dead soul. That's how I think of depression. It's almost like the solution to depression is grief, or some feeling. Depression tends to mute or clip that for just a second. Thank you. She says, if shame is hard to identify, but it is so pervasive, and we're suggesting that it goes with us as humans, what do you think most of us are experiencing or are willing to call it? I guess we have addressed it. That's a start, Angela. That's a start. Let me go further, Angela, in distinguishing what we're talking about with shame from what we're not talking about it. We've talked about this vicious cycle of shame, that once you get started in it, you just kind of dig yourself deeper and deeper. For example, if we go to the basketball analogy, Odie, and I can definitely relate to that as a basketball player in a previous incarnation, is that the thing about it is it may fool other people, but it doesn't fool us. And so there's some part of me that knows that this guy isn't a bad ball player and that I did foul up. I just can't allow myself to feel that. So I stuff it. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole. I knock it down here and it pops up someplace else. And that's what Angela's asking about. How does it manifest symptomatically? And so we end up carrying it around and end up, for example, having a very thin skin. I can't bear with any criticism, including my basketball playing. And so I'll ward it off however I can do that. And I just dig myself deeper and deeper into this spiral. This is where addictions will enter in. I can tell you that one of the addictions I've had and that I've worked on over the years is just truthfulness. I mean, honest to goodness, is that one way to not feel shame is just lie. Oh, that guy's not a good basketball player. And when I got into my own recovery, I realized it wasn't just about me stopping drinking and drugging. It was like looking at my life and all the things I was doing addictively, and one of them was lying. I don't care whether they call it white lies or black lies, whatever. It's lies. It's for the service of trying to keep up a front, and it's like, who am I really lying to? I'm lying to myself, And so I look at that as an addictive behavior for me. That is, what can I do to begin to relax that a little bit? And so I know that I'm sure that I've drunk alcohol and taken drugs. Well, there's no doubt about that. I've done that to reduce stress, to reduce shame. There's no doubt about that. And I know firsthand of how those can actually create more shame along the way. Well, I feel the same thing around my lying, and I'm going to call it addictive lying for right now. My lying only feeds back on itself because now on top of not being okay with having fouled up in basketball, now I'm a liar. I know that's not a compliment, to self. So what's to be done? Angela, one of the things that we want to do is distinguish, and we've talked about this a fair bit, but let's review it today. We want to distinguish between what I think of as toxic shame on the one hand. I'm using shame in a way right here, and it's used differently in different contexts. But I'm talking about the shame in terms of the shame that shuts me down, the shame that is a response to a threat of social acceptance or self-acceptance. I'm gonna refer to that as toxic. That's a toxic emotion, and I'm thinking of it even biologically. Is that there's not a one of us that can stay in a high cortisol space for long, because cortisol and adrenaline, the two stress hormones, they're corrosive. It's like drinking battery acid, literally. It's corrosive inside, so it's toxic. But I want to contrast that, and that really brings us to the topic for today and a couple of exercises. That brings us to the topic of how do we distinguish between rightful guilt. That's how I think of rightful guilt in contrast to toxic shame. How do we distinguish between guilt and shame, and then how does that manifest in terms of our attitudes towards ourselves and towards others? Yeah. So in terms of guilt, and I'm calling it rightful guilt because there's stuff that we do. I just give the example of lying. That's not okay. I should feel bad about that. But what we want to do with rightful guilt is separate out the lie that we just said, or in the case of addictions, we want to separate out the addictive behaviors, the things that we've done, from making ourselves bad, making ourselves somehow defective, wrong, or bad. Taking ownership for the mistakes I've made is guilt. Turning that into an assignment of blame, and put downs of myself, that's shame. Does that make a bit of sense to start with? Trying to separate between guilt and shame. Let me do this. Let's do an exercise to just kind of ground this, and Odie and I are going to kind of talk into this together. Can you think of a time when you've done something wrong and either somebody else or yourself made you wrong? Not just, so what I want to say here is it wasn't that you did something wrong or did something bad. We've all done things bad and wrong. But in this case, it actually made you bad. It made you wrong in the sense of it's not what you did, it's who you are. So we're looking at shame right now. So let's think about that for a second. Can you think of a time when something that you did that was wrong or bad made you wrong or bad? Class? Have you thought of something?
I have something.
Yes, I do too. Yeah. I do too. How about if you go first and I'll follow up on it. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
I want you all to be thinking of this as you're viewing this, because it really helps if you apply this to your own experience.
I'm not too sure of this. If I grasp completely what we're talking about here, but hopefully the story is aligned with it. But I remember when I was a kid, I went to the corner grocery store, like a quick stop that was by my house, and I remember not having any money, so I went inside of the store and I took an ice cream sandwich without paying for it. Yeah. So I stole it initially. So I took it, and I remember knowing that what I did wasn't right, but thinking, well, it's fine for now because I was hungry or whatever. And then later thinking, well, is this who I am? Like, am I somebody who steals things, or is it just this one instant, or am I somebody that steals things? That's exactly it. That's exactly. It's the somebody who steals things. Okay. That's what we're looking at. Okay. You did. So in one way of looking at it, and we're not just playing with words here, because the concept is important in terms of where it lands inside. On the one hand, you are someone who stole that ice cream sandwich. Right, that's undeniable. You're acknowledging it right here in front of God and everybody. Okay. So that's true. But the somebody who steals things turns it into a permanent trait, as opposed to something you did in a specific state. You were hungry, and you stole it. Right. But to turn that into a permanent trait, I am therefore somebody who steals,
as in terms of that's who you are now as a blanket statement about you, that feels inaccurate unless you continue to steal ice cream sandwiches.
Right.
I don't know if you're willing to talk about that in front of Austin and me.
If I continued to do that?
Right.
I did it a couple other times.
Oh, thank you. I feel bad because I wasn't really intending to put you on the spot with that. I have to tell you the truth, as you talked about it, I was remembering my early experiences of stealing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. So you're somebody who stole things.
Right.
Both of us are somebody who was addicted, whether to behaviors or to substance.
Mm-hmm.
And much of our audience here today is dealing with that either directly as being somebody who's in recovery from addiction, maybe actively in addiction, or a loved one of somebody who's addicted, or working with people who are in addiction. And it's a very, very important distinction to be made here, is that if I move into, I am a no good for nothing addict, what happens is that it cuts right to the quick in terms of my being able to be motivated to change it. If we turn you into a once and for all ice cream sandwich thief, it gets very hard to acknowledge that because who wants to carry that inside?
Yeah.
And so we actually are more apt to go into denial rather than work on changing our behavior, whether it's stealing something, toys, ice cream sandwiches, or engaging in addictive behaviors, substance or other behaviors. And so, so that gets us in the field. That's really it right there.
Okay.
Am I someone who, this is how you define me? I tell you what comes to mind. Have you ever had somebody say about you or somebody else, what kind of person, ... What kind of person stole ice cream sandwiches? Well, a human being comes to mind, a little boy who was hungry. And however it repeated itself, there's a story around each one of those. We're not talking about making excuses here, but if we're going to get to the bottom of that and stop stealing ice cream sandwiches in our lives, we have to find some way to think about that doesn't put us in the corner, paint us into the corner of shame. And so let's talk more into that. Let me introduce you to a guy. Here's a picture of a gentleman I'd like to introduce you to. This is, it's coming up, right here. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We talked about him once this past year. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the primary thinkers of the middle part of the 20th century. He was German by background. He happened to be a professor of philosophy and theology in Germany. He was also a pastor, a Lutheran pastor in Germany. He was very impactful in the first part of the 20th century, and at the time of Hitler, when Hitler and the Third Reich came into power, this was appalling to him for all kinds of reasons ethically. And that was his primary, Bonhoeffer's primary contribution was in the realm of ethics, right and wrong. And he was involved in, I just saw a bumper sticker on the way in here, and it's a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not going to quite remember it, but it applies to Bonhoeffer. I just made that connection, is that when, I'm going to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, is that when laws are unjust, he was talking about the British taxation of the colonies, I presume. When laws are unjust, then resistance becomes our duty. That's a paraphrase of Thomas Jefferson. That's exactly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer did. So here he was, a university professor, a theologian, and a pastor, and he joined with others, and they were involved in the attempt to assassinate Hitler. Unfortunately, the attempt was foiled. And this is a very sad reality. Here's one of the great intellects of the 20th century. He was executed. He was hung by the neck in the days right before the liberation of Germany, when the Allied forces descended and declared victory. Bonhoeffer was martyred in this process. He's an incredibly inspiring individual. One of his books that has really impacted me, I've studied him in past years. He has a book called The Cost of Discipleship. The cost, in his view, of following Christ, of following one's deepest integrity, one's deepest truth. And so I want to make sure that I attribute the next conversation, which is about grace, to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because this is a man who really lived what he was talking about. It's really quite an extraordinary story. Bonhoeffer made a distinction between what he called cheap grace and what he called costly grace. Cheap grace, as Bonhoeffer talks about it, is really in the realm of what we would be discussing around guilt, except it's the absence of any guilt. You should feel bad about it. I should be picking on you Because if it wasn't ice cream sandwiches, let me make sure if it wasn't ice cream sandwiches, it could have been some other ice cream. I'm sure that I have. Okay, it doesn't really matter. Is that we've all stolen ice cream sandwiches. Can we establish that? So if we collectively or individually feel no rightful guilt and then ask to be forgiven, whether it's with God or a friend or the store owner, that's what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace.
Yeah.
Because it's asking for something where we're not even owning up to being responsible for having stolen it. So you're confessing it. That's half the way to forgiveness. It's half the way to moving through this. It's just being able to acknowledge it. The same with my lying to cover my tracks, including in my addiction, is just beginning to admit to myself and to others. This is part of the value of working in the 12 steps, in the 12-step tradition. It's part of the value of being engaged regularly in self-help support groups, where the expectation is that you talk about what sandwich you stole this week. It's really that's really the essence of it.
Yeah.
How are you doing in your recovery right now? And we're asked to be truthful. So if cheap grace is assuming no rightful responsibility, no guilt for what we've done, then what did Bonhoeffer mean by costly grace? What he meant by costly grace is that it means taking responsibility just the way that Odie has. It's assuming rightful guilt with one very important inclusion, and that is, I should say, one very important exclusion. It's rightful guilt, but without toxic shame. That's where this gets very dicey and critical, is that to be able to admit that you stole the ice cream sandwich suggests to me that, first of all, that you take responsibility for it. It also suggests to me that you don't go down a sinkhole of toxic shame. Not to say that you haven't, not to say that I haven't, but in order to admit it, you have to have the shame at least somewhat corralled in, because the shame will silence you, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't be admitting it.
Absolutely.
So costly grace requires for me to own up to something, but without getting trapped in shame. So more specifically, how does this go in relationships? I told you we're going to apply this to relationships. With costly grace, if I've hurt you, I feel bad about it. I feel guilt. That's if I've hurt you, if I've stolen from you, I can be with you vulnerably in that, in your experience. I can also vow to you not only that I'm upset by my having done that, but vow to you that I'm going to change.
Yeah.
I did do it. I'm acknowledging that I stole from you. I did do it, and I'm also able to join you in our establishing a repair here. And part of that repair is, it's not enough for me to say I'm sorry.
Right.
It's enough to it's more important that I make amends, which would be, repay whatever I've stolen from you, and also promise not to do this again.
Yeah.
And it's only after all of that, this is costly grace, it's only after all of that I look at Yoda and I say, can you please forgive me? It's only after I've joined you in your pain, acknowledged my own deep remorse, vowed to you that I will change, that I won't do this again, make amends with you, and then I ask you for forgiveness. That's costly grace. Because Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a theologian. He believed that that's our stance before God. Is that it's not enough for us to go to God on bended knee and ask to be forgiven when we have no intention of changing the behavior or aren't really owning up to the costs of it, haven't really made amends with others, etc. So that's costly grace. Again, rightful guilt, but without toxic shame. What happens if we continue on, though, and look at rather than being able to kind of hold shame at bay and be with our guilt, what happens when we get sunk by shame? It's just the opposite of everything I shared with you. So with shame, if I've hurt you, there's no way I can even listen to you talking about it because it makes me feel so bad. I can't be vulnerable with you. So if you've ever done this yourself or been on the receiving end of it, have you ever had somebody do you wrong, and then when you bring it to their attention, they look at you with dead eyes?
Yeah.
My interpretation of the dead eyes, there's different reasons for that, but a good bit of the time, that's because they're in shame. It really is a deer in the headlights, and so a deer in the headlights can't be vulnerable with you. It's going to look like it doesn't care. How does it feel to have somebody wrong you, and then on top of that, look at you like you're crazy or that it doesn't matter? It's a gas on the fire, isn't it? It makes it much worse. And so that, unfortunately, this happens all too often, is that we get locked in shame, and in that shame, I can't be with you in any kind of open-hearted way with your own pain. On top of that, I can't own up to having caused it, and so I'll probably deny it. I didn't do that.
Right.
I didn't steal the ice cream sandwich. As I've got like a little thing of ice cream on my nose. I didn't steal it. What are you talking about? And why can't I do that? Because it makes me feel so bad about me. I can't acknowledge that to you. And so you can forget about my trying to change. Change what?
Right. Yeah.
Change what? I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. And then on top of that, if I don't own up to it, there's actually no repair possible for us. Because I'm not asking you to forgive me because I didn't do anything wrong. It's your problem. And all of this comes down to my feeling ashamed. If I were to acknowledge to you that I've done something wrong, if I was to be with you in your pain, if I was to own up to whatever I've done and then ask you for forgiveness, all of that would only make me feel more ashamed. So the problem with this is cheap grace, asking for cheap grace. The problem with this is there's no forgiveness possible. If I'm lost in toxic shame, and cheap grace will ask for you to forgive me when I won't acknowledge having stolen the sandwich. Yeah, and it won't even ask you to forgive me. I just say we should just get off my case.
Right.
There's no repair possible. There's no forgiveness. There's no forgiveness for you to offer to me because I've actually made it worse, right? I've made it worse. Now I act like I don't care and I'm all defensive and everything.
Yeah.
And maybe the as deep a pain is that there's no forgiveness of self because I'm not acknowledging it to myself. And any lies, anything that we've stolen, and we've all lied and we've all stolen.
Right.
And in addiction, it's rampant. Any lies that I'm trying to tell you are lies I'm telling myself. And so I leave not only separated from you as my friend, I leave separated from myself.
Yeah, it's very humbling to think about exactly everything that you're talking about right now. It's humbling now just to think back, and I'm sure you can relate, just where we are now at the point of our recovery and sobriety, and then thinking back of that's exactly how it was, exactly how you're mentioning it. It was just like...
For sure.
I'm sorry, but not really meaning it, you know, and then... And then thinking about it now and kind of reliving the time where we did, or where I did, come to that point of, you know, this needs to stop. You know, something needs to change, or else this is going to continue to happen, or it might get worse. And I might lose whatever it is that's valuable to me right now. So just thinking about that, it's humbling to think. I laugh at it because of the whole ice cream situation. Because right now I think about it, and it's almost, I think of my innocence of I didn't know any better, you know. And then I think, you know, that if I continued on to do that, I'm sure it could have turned into something a lot worse than just ice creams. You know, maybe ice creams one day, cars the next day, or something like that. So
there's a tenderness in thinking about when we're so young and first learning about these things. Why I associated to my own thievery as I was listening to you was that at a certain age, conscience wasn't fully formed, and it was only developed in some ways in reaction to having stolen for me a little toy car. It's like it didn't feel good, and I wouldn't have known that until I did it. For you, the ice cream stays with you because you stole it, and there was a naivete and innocence, and then the innocence is informed by the experience. And what would happen if we just kept overriding? There's feedback. You know, the toxic guilt is like putting your hand on a hot stove. You want to have that feedback. What would happen if I put my hand on a hot stove and I don't have the sensory input to be able to move my hand? It would burn my hand.
Right.
Well, it's possible that we can lie enough to ourselves or steal enough from others and so on, and then lie about that to where we don't feel the heat anymore from the oven. And, you know, I just talked with a group right before I came in today, and we were talking about this in terms of addiction. In active addiction, I actually used a term that I've thought of before. I don't know if I've ever used it. I said, in active addiction, most of us know what it's like to be in a state of acute sociopathy, which would be just the absence of conscience. In active addiction, we will say and do and believe the craziest things as a function of what addiction does to our souls, to our brains, however you want to understand that. And so there's a way that every one of us can get to a place where we don't care. The addiction drives the behavior, and it's actually stronger than any motivation, including being honest with the people that we love. That was specifically what we talked about today in the group. So, another comment, another question. This person says, I really like how you distinguish between guilt and shame. Thank you. Some people lump them together. They are lumped together a lot. You know what? We use these interchangeably. And by the way, when I'm out in the world and people use these, I never correct anybody. I just think that's geekish. Having said that, when we're talking in this context, I think the differentiation, the distinction can be really, really important. And I try to be careful using this. I have to tell you that I'll talk about, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of myself. And really what I mean by that, when I use that in a lay context, I'm going to continue that in just a second. I feel guilty. When I say I'm ashamed, I don't say I feel guilty. That sounds odd.
Yeah.
Saying I'm ashamed doesn't feel so odd. But having said that, when we're making these distinctions here, it's very critical. My key takeaway is if I get out of shame, then I feel motivated to correct the wrongs I did. Amen to that. That's absolutely right. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But if I'm stuck in shame, then I lose strength and motivation to make amends. Absolutely, and you're welcome. That's absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about that. What does shame do? It silences the hand on the stove. It silences the crucial messages within guilt. And what are some of those crucial messages? One of them, and we're talking about it, Odie, one of them is just humility, to recognize our limitations. I hope you understand how I use this term, to understand our fragility or our brokenness is that we can make mistakes and we learn from the heat of the oven to get our hand off of it. So shame will silence that message. It'll silence sensitivity. You remember how I talked about looking at somebody and looking like I don't care? There's no sensitivity possible in shame. It shuts me down, shuts down caring. And maybe most importantly, and I think this is implied in what this person just said, it shuts down self-correction. If I don't have guilt, then I'll keep stealing. There's nothing to stop me. If I'll keep putting my hand on the stove. And so the guilt is an incredibly important feature. And the problem is with shame is it comes in and it squashes that or overrides that. Here's another comment or question. This makes me wonder how I can be supportive to someone else who's stuck in shame and can't see it yet, and also has cut off the rightful guilt process. Any thoughts? Give me just a second with that. It's a great question. I'll tell you, I do so much teaching of this material in the groups that I lead that I'm used to talking about it the way that we're talking about it. But I think what I want to do is I want to use the example of Odie today. When we did the exercise, you brought up ice cream sandwiches. What came up for me was there's such a sweetness or an innocence about that. What came up for me are the years of active addiction in which I lied and cheated and stole repeatedly, and how I felt so bad about it and would use in order to try to quell those feelings of badness. And so what I want to say in response to the question is how can you be supportive? I think one way to be supportive is to self-disclose with the kind of vulnerability that Odie just evidenced today. I think it's one thing to talk about these ideas, to say, it might help to make a distinction here between shame and guilt. People are worried about getting rid of shame because they're feeling like it's going to mean getting rid of guilt. I often make this distinction is that when we're talking about getting rid of shame, we're not talking about making excuses. You stole the ice cream sandwich. I was addicted for years and did a lot of lying. A lot of friends close to me knew nothing about it. It was just complete lying going on, secrecy and so on like that. It's not about making excuses for that. It's trying to come to an understanding of that, including an understanding of how shame itself became part of it. And I feel like that talking about that with clear language is important, but I feel like even more important may be wow, that's weird. We've all done our version of it. That's why we can use stealing ice cream sandwiches as a metaphor for all the things that we've done that we feel guilty about. And the tricky part is, can we hold that like you have and modeled it here in public and not sink into shame? I think one of the central crimes of shame is that it leaves us cut off from others. You opened up. Shame would lead you to close down. And so I in terms of an antidote to others' shame, if I can, I do this a lot. I was not good at this early on. I was like the worst candidate for 12-step programs that ever existed because I didn't want to talk about my ice cream sandwich experiences. And you go to those meetings day after day,
Yeah.
week after week, month after month, year after year, and you get practice at talking about it to where now I am much more able and willing on a good day, and have many more good days than bad days, to self-disclose. And so I do this all the time with the clients that I work with now. And so they say, Dr. Bob, tell us your story. Oh, do we have to? But we do. We talk about it as I invite them to tell their stories, as you shared your story.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the self-disclosing and being transparent. I like the way that Brene Brown talks about this in her work on shame. It's about being vulnerable. It's about exposing our wounds. Vulnerability comes from the Latin root of vulnus, which means wound. It's about my bringing my vulnerability, my wounds. And I feel like that's a huge piece of it. It's almost like the medium is the message. If I want somebody to be vulnerable to their own guilt and able to distinguish that from shame, can I model that myself by myself being vulnerable? Let's finish with one more exercise. Can you think of an instance where shame shut you off from being able to ask for forgiveness on the one hand, or on the other hand, shut you off from being able to grant yourself forgiveness or compassion? Can you think of an instance where it shut you off? I want to leave you with that exercise for today, to do some pondering. I'm hoping that you'll find what Odie's model for us. Hoping you'll find examples of that in your own life, and think about times that you've hidden away from others something because it was so shameful to you. And in some ways, the worst of it is hiding away from ourselves. I think of Sigmund Freud, the founder of modern psychoanalysis. He said that to repress something is to forget it, and then to forget that we forgot it. It's like I hide from you that I stole something, and then I hide from myself that. And when I hide it from myself, it's lost to me. It goes into the unconscious, whatever, that's what Freud called it. And then it gets to manifest symptomatically. And what I mean by that is it'll manifest as ulcers, or worse, it'll manifest as addiction. Freud had this view that if something moves into the unconscious, that just means it's out of awareness. It doesn't go away. I had a therapist for years that said, Bob, you can either deal with something coming in the front door, that would be consciously, or it will find a side door or a back door to get into your life. And that's the image that comes to mind, is that there's no getting away from it. Freud called it the return of the repressed. That which is repressed will return, and oftentimes in monstrous form. I honestly believe that many of our nightmares, many of my nightmares, I feel like, are symbolic of things that I haven't wanted to deal with. And so it started off as an ice cream sandwich, and now it's a dragon. It's like, what the heck happened? Sheesh. Okay, you guys, there is hope. There is hope here. And the hope is that we would be able to learn how to feel guilt, rightful guilt, but stay open to righting the wrongs that we've committed. And that's only possible when we're not sunk by shame. That's only possible. And so we're looking at costly grace. And you may, well, where's the grace in that? The grace is that there's forgiveness at all. That's the grace. Yeah. I liked how we talked about it before the group today. It's like it's unmerited. Sometimes people will talk about grace as being unmerited favor, whether it's with God or with another human being. I don't deserve this, and yet you're granting me favor. That's the grace. And all that Bonhoeffer's adding to it is that grace must be costly. It must be grace with integrity. And it's still fully grace. It's just that it's grace that owns up to what I've done wrongly. I like how Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, he was the student of Freud, he put it this way: it's impossible to be forgiven for a sin that one hasn't committed. Which sounds odd. It's impossible to be forgiven for a sin I haven't committed. If I don't acknowledge it, there's no grace forthcoming. Does that make sense? Yeah. The cost is having to admit it. Once having admitted it before God or before a loved one, is then forgiveness is possible. And so that's the hope, it seems like to me, is that grace abounds, but only in the context of transparency, only in the context of my being open to bring that to you.
May I add something to that?
Yes, you certainly may.
Thank you. So I've heard this illustration before about grace by a pastor.
I'd love to hear it.
I forgot what he compared it to, but he basically compared it to something else. And then his explanation for grace was you get pulled over by a cop because you were doing 70 and a 30. And so that's usually an automatic suspension of license, but they pull you over. and they go, you know what? I'm not going to write you a ticket or anything, so you're free to go. Oh, by the way, here's my 401k. I thought that was pretty good.
And what's the significance of the 401k?
So that's what grace is, basically. It's just like, or I think he compared it to mercy. Like, mercy is, I'm not going to give you a ticket.
Yeah.
Grace is, here's my 401k. I think that was the complete of that.
Yeah, that's a very powerful image. Yeah. For the people that I work with who are in recovery and they get their lives back and loved ones are able to forgive them, I think it feels like a 401k. It's big. It's big.
Yeah.
It's just not a kind of a mercy with clenched teeth. It's like trust and grace. We were just talking about this today. What it feels like to work hard to change your life from addiction to a commitment to recovery, and what it's like to earn trust where there were dead eyes and hopelessness before. What that's like is like a 401k on steroids. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Thank you for that image.
Sure.
Thank you all for joining us today. We'll be coming back next week to kind of finalize this particular visitation on shame. And what I want to look at next week is I want to take what we've been talking about personally and apply it. What would it be like to live in a world? What would it be like to live in a society that operated less by shame and more by grace? And so we'll be talking about that next week. The title of next week's topic is Imagine a World Without Shame. Out of great respect to John Lennon. So I hope that you'll come back and join us next week. If you have any final comments or questions, be sure to send those to the Facebook group, Ask an Addiction Specialist, and Austin and Odie will get those to me. Or you can write me at my website, which is just my name, drbobweathers.com. I wasn't born Dr. Bob Weathers. It occurs to me I'm just Bob Weathers, but Dr. Bob Weathers is the website. Okay, just want to make sure that was clear. If you write me there, it'll be clear that there's a contact me, and you can write me any comments or questions that you have. Thanks for joining us this week, and you know what? I wish you a week of grace. Thanks, Odie. Thank you, Austin. Take care.